"Too stubborn," he said, and handed her bag back like she was something he'd ordered and returned. Clara Whitmore didn't cry. She stood on that frozen Wyoming platform and let the wind cut through her coat while Henry Dalton walked away without a second glance. She had traveled 900 miles to marry a stranger, and she'd been sent back before she even made it to his door. If you've ever been told your strength was your flaw, stay with me. This story was made for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow Clara's journey all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rejection didn't happen quietly. That was the part Clara would carry with her longest, not the words themselves, but the audience. Abigail Fletcher had arranged the introduction at the Millstone Hotel in Laramie, a two-story building that smelled of pipe smoke and wet wool, and she had done so with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd brokered 30 such meetings and expected this one to proceed like the others. Clara had dressed carefully that morning. Dark blue traveling dress hair pinned without vanity boots polished as well as worn leather allowed. She had told herself she would be calm, practical. She had told herself this was a transaction, not a performance, and that she would not pretend to be something she wasn't just to get through the first hour. She hadn't lasted 20 minutes. Henry Dalton was a cattleman from Sheridan County, 51 years old, twice widowed, and built like a man who had never once in his life been told no. He sat across the small table from Clara, with his hat still on his head, and his arms crossed over his chest, and he looked at her the way a buyer looks at livestock assessing detached, already calculating what the upkeep would cost him. "You've been in Boston how long?" he asked. "My whole life," Clara said. "Born there, raised there. And you're running from it." "I'm leaving it," she said. "There's a difference." He didn't like that. She saw it in the way his jaw shifted. "Mrs. Fletcher tells me you worked as a seamstress, managed the books for the shop the last 3 years. That's right. Any cooking experience managing a household staff?" "I managed a household of 4 without any staff," Clara said, "on a seamstress's wages. So yes." He studied her for a moment. "You answer fast. Is that a problem?" "Depends on whether you're answering or arguing." Clara set her hands flat on the table. She had promised herself she would be calm. She was being calm. This was as calm as she knew how to be when a man spoke to her like she was a position he was filling rather than a person he was considering. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "I didn't come 900 miles to audition. Mrs. Fletcher sent you my letters. You know who I am. If you have questions about my character or my capability, ask them directly and I'll answer them honestly. That's the best I can offer." The silence that followed was not the contemplative kind. Henry Dalton pushed back from the table and looked at Abigail Fletcher, who stood near the window, with her arms folded and her expression unreadable. "She's exactly like her letters," he said. Not to Clara, to Abigail, as if Clara had left the room. "She is," Abigail said carefully. "I said she was spirited. I didn't say I wanted spirited living in my house." He stood, reached for his coat on the back of the chair. "I need a woman who can manage the home without managing me. This one would have an opinion on everything I did before the first winter was out." "Mr. Dalton," Abigail began. "I appreciate your time, Mrs. Fletcher. Send my regrets to Miss Whitmore." He put on his coat. He picked up his hat. And then, as though remembering Clara was still sitting 3 feet away, he glanced at her and said without malice, without cruelty, without a single flicker of recognition that he was saying something devastating. Too stubborn. Not suitable. And he walked out. Clara sat very still. The fire in the small hearth crackled. Somewhere in the hotel below a man laughed at something. The world continued its noise completely indifferent. Abigail crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair Henry Dalton had just vacated. She was 60 years old, and had the kind of face that had long since stopped performing sympathy it didn't feel, but there was something in her expression now. Not pity exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. "That's the second time this year," she said quietly. "I know," Clara said. "The first was Morrison in Cheyenne. I remember. He said you were argumentative. He told me my opinion on the drought was wrong, and then asked me to explain why I thought so. I explained. He called it argumentative. Clara finally moved, pulling her gloves from the table and folding them in her lap. I've been trying to figure out what the difference is between having a mind and being difficult, Mrs. Fletcher. I haven't worked it out yet. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have enough money to get back to Boston?" "Yes." "Good, because I don't have another placement for you here. Not after this. Word travels in Laramie and Henry Dalton has friends." Clara looked up at her. "I'm not going back to Boston." "Clara, my mother went back." Her voice was even, controlled, the way a voice gets when the feeling behind it is too large to let out all at once. "She went back every time something didn't work. Back to the house, back to my uncle's decisions, back to a life that got smaller and smaller until she just stopped taking up space in it. She died at 53, Mrs. Fletcher, in the same bedroom she'd been born in, having never once lived anywhere she'd chosen for herself." Clara stood. "I will not go back to Boston." Abigail looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing actual calculation. "There is one other name," she said slowly, "but I haven't offered it to you because I didn't think you'd consider it." "Tell me." "Luke Carver, Cedar Creek Ranch, about 40 miles west of here." Abigail paused. "He's 38, former Army, runs cattle and some horses. The ranch is solvent, actually doing better than most out here right now from what I understand." "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing is wrong with him exactly." Abigail seemed to choose her next words with the care of someone handling something fragile. "He's had 3 arrangements before. None of them lasted past the first season. The women all left." "Why? He doesn't talk. Not the way people expect. He works from before dawn until after dark, and then he comes in and sits and doesn't say much, and then he sleeps. And then he does it again. There's no performance to him. No warmth in the way people mean warmth. The women said they felt like they were living alongside a wall." Abigail folded her hands. "One of them told me she'd have preferred a cruel man to an absent one. At least cruelty was a kind of attention." Clara was quiet, thinking. "There's also the matter of the wolf," Abigail added. "The wolf. He has a relationship with a wolf pack that ranges his northern pasture, feeds them through winter. People in town find it strange. There's a lead wolf, big gray male, that's been seen near the ranch house. Carver calls him Ghost." She paused. "People in Cedar Creek have taken to calling Carver the wolf, and they don't mean it as a compliment. Do you think he's dangerous?" "No," Abigail said with a certainty that surprised Clara. "I've met him. He's not dangerous. He's just very alone, and very particular about his solitude. But he's looking for a wife. He put in a request, yes. Though I'm not entirely sure why, given the history." Abigail looked at her steadily. "Clara, I'm telling you this because you asked me to be direct with you. This is not a comfortable placement. 3 women left. He has a reputation. The winters out there are serious, and the isolation is real." "Is he a good man?" The question seemed to catch Abigail slightly off guard. She thought about it genuinely. It seemed, rather than reflexively. "I believe so," she said finally. "Rough around everything. But yes, I think so." Clara put on her gloves. "Write him a letter. Tell him I'd like to come." She arrived at Cedar Creek Ranch on a Thursday morning in November, when the sky was the color of an old bruise and the wind had teeth in it. There was no one at the station to meet her. She had been told in the brief functional correspondence that followed Abigail's introduction. Luke Carver wrote letters the way a man hammers nails. One precise strike after another. No word wasted that a wagon would be waiting. The wagon was there. A dun mare stood hitched to it, patient and still, with a note tied to the seatboard. "Road goes west. Follow it. Gates open. See." Clara looked at the note for a moment. Then she looked at the wagon. Then she untied her trunk from the station cart herself, loaded it into the wagon bed, climbed up onto the seat, and followed the road west. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. She'd built no pictures in her mind on purpose, knowing pictures led to disappointment. But she had perhaps imagined something more formal about arrival. A meeting at the door at least. Some minimal gesture toward the occasion of a woman coming to live in a man's home for the first time. What she found instead when she came through the gate and pulled up to the main house was a man mending a section of fence along the near paddock. He had his back to her. He did not turn immediately when the wagon wheels crunched to a stop. He finished the section he was working on. She could see him set the wire test. The tension set the next staple, and only then did he turn around. Luke Carver was taller than she'd pictured. Dark-haired, going gray at the temples with a face that had been weathered without being broken. He had the kind of stillness that wasn't passivity. It was the stillness of a man who had decided some long time ago that most motion was wasted motion and had arranged his life accordingly. He looked at her across the distance between them with dark eyes that gave nothing away. He walked over, stopped about 5 feet from the wagon. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carver." A pause. He looked at the trunk in the wagon bed. "Bring that yourself." There was no one at the station. There was a wagon. "Yes," Clara said. "There was a wagon and a note. I managed." He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached up and took the trunk from the wagon bed, like it weighed nothing, and carried it toward the house without another word. Clara tied off the mare, took her traveling bag from the seat, and followed him inside. Hotad. The first week was unlike anything she'd been warned to expect, not because it was better than the warnings, but because the warnings had prepared her for coldness, and this was something different. Luke Carver was not cold. He was simply elsewhere. He occupied the same space as her, ate at the same table, moved through the same rooms, but there was a quality to his presence that reminded her of weather. Enormous and real, and completely without interest in being acknowledged. He woke at 4:30 every morning. She heard him through the wall, not because he was loud, but because she was a light sleeper, and the house was profoundly quiet in a way that Boston never had been. She would hear the creak of his boots on the floor, the sound of water, the door to the outside. And then she would lie in the dark and listen to the silence he left behind. The first morning, she got up at 5 and started the stove and made coffee. When he came in at 7 for the morning break, he found it waiting. He poured himself a cup, drank it standing, and said nothing. She waited. He rinsed the cup and went back out. That night at supper, he said without preamble, without looking up from his plate, "Coffee was good." It was, she would later think, the beginning of something. Not romance. Not warmth in any conventional sense. Just acknowledgement. The first small proof that he was aware she was there. By the second week, she had established a rhythm. The house had been functional, but neglected in the specific way of a bachelor home, not filthy, but stripped of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She found the kitchen well-stocked but disorganized. The root cellar packed without system, the mending basket overflowing in a way that suggested it had been ignored for at least a season. She didn't ask permission to reorganize. She didn't announce her intentions. She simply began working the same way he did, and let the work speak. He noticed. She could tell not because he said anything, but because he watched her the way he watched his horses, with a steady assessing attention that was neither approving nor disapproving. Just observing. Taking inventory. The first real conversation they had that lasted more than 4 exchanges happened on the 9th day over a breakfast of salt pork and biscuits, when she made the mistake, or perhaps it wasn't a mistake, of asking about Ghost. "Mrs. Fletcher told me about the wolf," she said. Luke set down his fork. Not in anger, but with the particular stillness of a man who has been asked something he wasn't expecting and is deciding what to do about it. "What did she tell you?" "That you feed a pack through winter, that there's a lead male you call Ghost, that people in town find it strange." He was quiet for a moment. People in town find a lot of things strange. "Do you care?" Another pause. He picked his fork back up. "No." "Then why mention it at all, the wolf?" "I didn't. You did." She nearly smiled. "Why Ghost?" He looked at her, then directly for the first time. Not a long look, but full. "First time I saw him," he said. "I thought he wasn't real. Big gray wolf just standing at the tree line in a January snowstorm looking at me. I walked toward him. He didn't run. He just disappeared, like he was never there." He paused. "Took me 3 months before I saw him solid enough to believe in." Clara thought about that. "How long ago?" 4 years. "And you still feed them?" "Through the hard winters, when the elk move south and the rabbits are down." He looked back at his plate. "They don't need me, but it costs me nothing to help." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That's not a strange thing, Mr. Carver. That's a decent thing." He said nothing. But something shifted in the room, barely perceptible the way pressure changes before weather turns. Not much, but enough that she noticed it. The trouble arrived from town on a Friday afternoon, wearing a name she didn't know yet, Walt Greer. He came on horseback, pulling up at the front of the house while Luke was out at the north pasture, and he looked at Clara on the porch with the particular smile of a man who has decided in advance that he doesn't respect what he's looking at. "You'd be the new one," he said. Clara put down the harness she'd been mending. "Clara Whitmore. Can I help you?" "Walt Greer. I run the feed and supply out of Cedar Creek." He didn't dismount. "Heard Carver finally got another woman out here. Didn't think she'd last past the first week." "It's the second week," Clara said. "So it is." He looked her over in a way that was meant to be noticed. "You know about the others. I know there were previous arrangements that didn't continue." "Yes, didn't continue." He seemed to find that amusing. "That's a gentle way to put it. First one left in March, said she'd rather freeze in Cheyenne than stay another night. Second one didn't even unpack her full trunk. Third one, Ruth Callie, nice woman from Ohio, she lasted almost 4 months. His expression shifted into something more deliberate. "She told me Carver wasn't right. Not dangerous, she said. Just empty. Like something in him had gone out a long time ago and no one had bothered to relight it." Clara met his eyes. "Is there something you need from the ranch today, Mr. Greer?" "A delivery. A message for Mr. Carver." "Just being neighborly." "Then I'll tell him you stopped by. Good afternoon." She turned and went back inside, and she did not let herself show anything until the sound of his horse had faded down the road. Then she stood in the kitchen with her hands on the table and breathed. Empty, she thought. Like something had gone out. She thought about the wolf at the tree line. She thought about 3 months of patience before something wild trusted you enough to be seen. She thought about her mother and the bedroom she'd died in and all the space she'd never let herself take up. When Luke came in that evening, she told him Walt Greer had stopped by. His expression didn't change, but his hands stilled around his coffee cup for just a moment. What did he want? "To tell me about the other women," Clara said. "To see if I'd be frightened." Luke looked at her across the table. "Were you—" She held his gaze. "No." The silence that followed was different from the silences before. Not empty. Not absent. Something in it had weight, had texture, had the particular quality of two people who have each said something true and are now deciding what to do with the truth between them. Luke set down his cup. "Road gets icy by December," he said. "I'll show you the stable route in the morning. Safer if you need to get to the animals in the dark." It was not a declaration. It was not a gesture. It was a man who had decided quietly, practically, in the way he decided everything, that she was going to be here in December. That she was for the first time someone he was planning around. Clara nodded. "Thank you," she said. And outside, somewhere in the dark of the north pasture, a wolf called once into the cold Wyoming sky, low and long and utterly without apology, and then went quiet again, as if it had said exactly what it meant to say and needed no answer. The stable route Luke showed her the next morning took 11 minutes to walk. She knew because she counted the way she'd learned to count everything that mattered. Steps to the well, Steps to the woodpile steps between her and the nearest exit in any room she'd ever had to survive in. Old habit. Boston habit. The kind of thing you did when your life was managed by other people and measuring your own geography was the only power left. Luke walked it, once pointed out where the ground dipped under ice where the fence post leaned, and could catch a sleeve in the dark where the stable latch froze and needed to be struck with the heel of a hand rather than forced. He didn't explain why he was telling her. He just told her. Practical, precise. The way he did everything. "You do this every morning?" she asked when they reached the stable door. 4:30. Horses first, then the south pasture check, then back for the cattle. Alone. Always. She looked at him. "Did you ever ask any of the others to come?" He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just thinking. No. Why not? Didn't seem like something they'd want. He pushed the stable latch with the heel of his hand exactly as he'd demonstrated. "You asking because you want to?" Clara considered the question honestly. "I'm asking because I want to understand what this place is," she said. "What a day here actually looks like. Not the version I imagined from Boston." "What version did you imagine?" "Simpler," she said. "Quieter. Less physical." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of the idea of one. "It's physical," he agreed. She started coming to the stable at 4:30. Not every morning she didn't announce it or make it a declaration. The first time she simply appeared already dressed, already pulling on her gloves. And he looked at her for a moment and then handed her the feed bucket without a word. They moved through the morning chores in the particular silence of two people who have discovered they can occupy the same space without friction, and when they came back inside and she put the coffee on and he sat at the table and pulled off his outer gloves. The kitchen felt different. Not warmer exactly, but inhabited. Like a room that had been a room for so long it had forgotten what that meant and was just now starting to remember. 3 mornings in, he told her about the mare. Her name was Calico, which was not her official name, but what Luke called her because her coloring defied better description. She was the most difficult horse in his string, brilliant and nervous, and prone to what Luke described in his characteristic brevity as opinions. "Opinions," Clara repeated. "She doesn't like to be handled the same way twice. If you repeat yourself with her, she stops listening." He was checking Calico's near foreleg, running his hand down with quiet efficiency. Most men who've worked with her got frustrated, tried to break the pattern out of her. Did it work? Made her worse. He stood, patted Calico's flank once. "She's not being difficult. She's being honest. She just doesn't see why she should pretend otherwise." Clara looked at him. He was not looking at her, he'd moved on to the next stall. But she felt the sentence land anyway, felt it settle somewhere precise and deliberate, and she thought he knows exactly what he just said. She didn't call attention to it. She just filed it away the way she was learning to file everything about Luke Carver, not for later use, but because she was beginning to understand that with this man, nothing was accidental. The words were just sparse. That didn't mean they were empty. Walt Greer came back on a Wednesday. This time he came with another man, younger, loose-limbed, with the look of someone who'd borrowed his confidence from whoever happened to be standing next to him. He introduced himself as Pete Aldridge, and Clara recognized the name from the Cedar Creek supply ledger she'd found in the kitchen drawer and quietly organized. Aldridge ran a small outfit 2 miles east, and he owed Luke 3 months of unpaid fence repair credit that Luke had apparently never bothered to collect. She filed that away too. They tied their horses at the post, and Greer called out before she even reached the porch. "Miss Whitmore, Carver around?" "He's working," she said. "When's he back?" "When the work's done." Greer settled his weight back on his heels and smiled with his mouth only. "We heard in town you've been making some changes out here. Reorganizing things." "Organizing," Clara said. "The kitchen and the root cellar, that's all." "People are talking," he said. saying the place looks different. I'm not sure how anyone in town would know what the inside of this kitchen looks like, Clara said. But if they do, I hope they find it encouraging. Aldridge laughed a short, surprised sound, like he hadn't expected her to be quick. Greer's smile cooled a fraction. You're brave, Greer said. I'll give you that. The others weren't stupid women, just couldn't handle. I know what you're doing, Clara said. Her voice was pleasant and absolutely flat. You're coming out here to tell me things you think will unsettle me because a woman who leaves saves you the trouble of whatever it is you want from this ranch when it doesn't have anyone managing it. I don't know yet what that is, but I'll find out. She looked at him steadily. Was there anything else? Greer stared at her. Aldridge's horse shifted its weight and blew out a long breath through its nose. Just being neighborly, Greer said for the second time. The words had less conviction now. You're welcome to leave a message for Mr. Carver. Otherwise, good afternoon. She went back inside. Her hands were shaking slightly when she reached the kitchen, and she put them flat on the table and breathed through it. Not from fear, from the specific physical response of adrenaline that had nowhere to go, the body's honest reaction to standing her ground when every learned instinct said to soften, to apologize, to take up less space. She was still standing that way when the back door opened and Luke came in. He took one look at her hands on the table and said Greer and Pete Aldridge. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what did he say? The same things as before, more or less. Testing to see if I'd break. She looked up at him. Luke, does he want the ranch? The directness of the question, his first name out loud for the first time, seemed to register. He didn't react visibly, but something in him stilled in the particular way she was learning to read the way a held breath registers in a man who almost never lets you see him breathe. There's a water access dispute, he said finally. Cedar Creek feeds both my north pasture and his eastern field. The original survey has a line Greer's been arguing for 2 years. He moved to the water basin, washed his hands with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. He's made 2 offers on the ranch. I've said no both times. What happens to the water access if you sell? Reverts to county control, gets reassigned. Which means he'd likely get it. Yes. Clara thought about the 3 women who'd left. She thought about the specific patient pressure of a man who wanted something and understood that emptying a house was sometimes the first step to taking it. He's been hoping you'd give up, she said. That's why he keeps coming. That's why he told them what he told them. Luke dried his hands. He turned and looked at her with that full measuring look, the one she'd only seen a few times, but that always felt like being taken seriously in a way that nothing in Boston had ever managed. Yes, he said. Well, Clara said, I'm not leaving. The silence after that was the longest they'd had. She didn't look away, and he didn't look away, and the kitchen held its breath around them. Then Luke said in a voice that was quieter than his usual quiet, I know. And somehow, in the economy of everything, he didn't say those 2 words carried the weight of a sentence 3 times as long. November deepened, and with it came the work that Clara had not fully anticipated, not the household tasks which she'd managed and expanded without difficulty, but the outdoor labor that the season demanded. Luke had a hired man named Cord, who came 3 days a week for the heavy lifting. But between Cord's visits, there was always more than one person could do, and Luke had spent years adjusting his expectations downward rather than counting on help. Clara adjusted them back up. She learned to read the cattle which animals were off their feed, which were showing the early signs of respiratory illness that could spread fast in cold weather, which needed to be moved before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. Luke taught her in his way, which was to do the thing himself once with her beside him, and then the second time, wait to see if she'd understood. Most times she had. When she hadn't, she said so directly and asked the specific question, and he answered it without condescension, without the labored patience of a man explaining something to someone he didn't believe could learn. He just answered, like she was capable, like the question was a reasonable one, She realized the first time in her adult life that she had been taught something by a man who didn't seem to find her intelligence surprising. "You ever run cattle before?" he asked her one afternoon while they were cutting out a heifer that needed attention. "Never, but I watched you do this with that steer last week. The body position is the same you're using where you stand to tell them where to go." He looked at her. "Yes, it's like a conversation," she said, "just without words." "Most conversations are better without them," he said, and moved off to close the gate. She laughed, a real one, sudden catching herself by surprise. She covered it quickly, but not quickly enough. He glanced back at her. He didn't smile, but there was something in his face, a brief, unguarded warmth there, and gone in half a second, like a match struck in the wind. It was the first time she'd seen it. She didn't mention it. But she thought about it that night, lying awake listening to the wind move against the house, and she thought about it with a complicated mixture of things, something that felt like hope and frightened her because of that, and something that felt like grief for every version of herself that had been told hope was the same as foolishness. The letter arrived from Boston on a Thursday in the second week of November, and it came as things from Boston always did, with the texture of obligation wrapped in the language of concern. Her uncle Edward Whitmore wrote in his careful copperplate that he had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Clara had taken up residence in Wyoming Territory under uncertain circumstances, and that he and her aunt were naturally concerned for her well-being and her future. The letter was 2 pages long. It took him 1 3/4 of those pages to arrive at the actual point, which was that a position had become available in his office bookkeeping, modest but respectable, and that he would be willing to hold it for her if she returned by the 1st of December. He did not ask if she was well. He did not ask if she was happy. He offered her a cage and called it rescue. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she folded it, set it beside her coffee cup, and sat with it for a long moment. Luke came in from the morning check and saw her face before she'd had a chance to compose it. He didn't ask. He poured his coffee, sat down across from her, and waited. After a moment, she pushed the letter across the table. He read it without expression, set it back down. "Your uncle," he said. "He's been managing the family property since my father died. He's good at it. He likes order. He likes knowing where things are and what they'll do." She turned her cup in her hands. "He managed my mother that way too. Managed her right out of any version of herself that wasn't convenient for everyone else." Luke was quiet. "I'm not going back," she said. It came out more forceful than she intended, not directed at Luke, just needing to be said aloud, to be real. "I want you to know that in case the letter made you think I was reconsidering." "I didn't think that," he said. "You're sure?" He looked at her steadily. "You stood on this porch and told Greer he wasn't going to move you. I don't think a letter from Boston is going to do what Greer couldn't." Something in her chest loosened a knot she hadn't known she was holding. She nodded, picked up her coffee cup. Then Luke said carefully, in the specific tone of a man choosing something difficult, "What happened to her, your mother?" Clara set down her cup. No one in Wyoming had asked her about her mother. No one in Boston had asked in a way that wanted a real answer. She looked at Luke Carver across the table, this quiet, contained man who had just for the first time deliberately asked something personal, not to be polite, not to fill the silence, because he wanted to know. She was brilliant, Clara said. Actually brilliant. She read everything. She had opinions about politics and agriculture and architecture, and she could argue any side of a question with evidence and precision. She paused. "When she married my father, his family told her to be less visible about it. She tried. When he died and she went to my uncle's house, he told her the same thing. Just be quieter, Clara. Just be easier." Her voice was even, steady. And she was eventually. She got quieter and smaller. And by the time I was 15, she barely said anything at all in company. She'd just sit and smile, and you could see it, the person she'd been, still living somewhere behind her eyes with no way out. She looked at her hands. "I used to think if I could just find the right argument, the right words, I could unlock her again. I tried for years. Luke was very still. "She died," Clara said, "being called the sweetest, most agreeable woman in the county. And nobody in that county had met her." The silence after that was the kind that asks for nothing and holds everything. Luke reached across the table. He didn't touch her hand. He set his coffee cup down beside hers, close enough that they were almost touching, a gesture so small and deliberate it could have been accidental, and both of them knew it wasn't. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," he said quietly. Clara's throat tightened. She looked at the two cups side by side on the table. "She was," she said. "She really was." Ghost came closer on a Thursday evening, close enough that Clara saw him from the kitchen window. Not a shape at the tree line, but an actual wolf, solid and gray and enormous, standing in the near pasture not 20 yards from the fence. She opened the back door without thinking. The wolf looked at her, clear-eyed, unhurried. He lifted his nose once, scenting assessing, and then turned and disappeared into the dark at a walk, as if he'd simply decided he'd seen enough. Luke was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. "He came to the fence," she said. "He's been doing that." Luke moved past her to close the door, but slowly watching the tree line. "He started a week after you got here." She turned. "What does that mean?" "Don't know." He was quiet for a moment. "Ghost doesn't come this close when something's wrong. He comes when—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence or the direction it was taking. "When what?" Clara asked. Luke looked at her. The kitchen light was behind her, and he was standing in the doorway, and there was a moment, brief, uncharted, charged with the particular electricity of a thing that has not yet been spoken and may not survive being spoken, where something passed across his face that she had never seen there before. "When the place feels less empty," he said finally. He turned and went back to the table, sat, reached for his coffee. Clara stood at the closed door for a moment, her hand still on the latch. Outside, somewhere past the pasture fence, a wolf called, once low, trailing absolutely certain, and the sound moved through the dark Wyoming air, like a chord, struck on an instrument she hadn't known could make music, and she stayed very still and let it finish. And then she went and sat back down, and they didn't speak again for the rest of the evening. And it was the most she had ever felt in a silence in her life. The snow came in the third week of November without warning or apology, the way serious weather always does in Wyoming, not as a gradual gray settling, but as a full committed fact, arriving overnight and still going when Clara woke at 4:15 and heard Luke already moving in the next room. She was dressed and at the stable door before he got there. He looked at her, looked at the snow, looked back at her. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. He handed her the feed bucket. They worked through the storm in a silence that had evolved into something neither of them had named, yet not comfortable, exactly, because comfort implied ease, and there was nothing easy about two people with that much guarded history sharing the same cold air before dawn. But functional. Honest. The kind of silence that meant both people had stopped performing the absence of feeling and were just present. In the same place at the same time with their actual selves, which was rarer than most people understood. The cattle were restless. 3 steers had pushed through to the south fence line in the night and needed cutting back, and Luke moved through it with his characteristic efficiency, while Clara managed the gate, reading the animals, the way he'd shown her body position, pressure release, and when the last steer was back through and she swung the gate closed and latched it, she looked up and found him watching her. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "They weren't going to hurt me. They just needed to know where I wanted them." Most people freeze, the size of them. Most people probably didn't grow up with an uncle who expressed his opinions the same way, she said. You learn to hold your ground. He almost smiled. It got closer every time a thing almost arriving. It was Cord who told her about the survey. He came that Friday stomping snow off his boots at the back door, and he had the look of a man carrying something he wasn't sure he was supposed to be carrying. He was 34, taciturn, in the way of men who work alone, and he had over the past 2 weeks shifted from regarding Clara with neutral skepticism to treating her with the quiet respect of a man who values competence above almost everything else. She had fixed the north stable latch he'd been tolerating for 6 months. That appeared to have settled his opinion of her. Greer was at the county office Tuesday. Cord said not to. Luke wasn't in yet, but to Clara in the specific manner of a man who has decided she is the right person to hear something. Asking about the survey records for the water line, the original survey. He paused. He had a man with him, legal type, from Cheyenne. Clara was still. A lawyer. That's what Hicks at the county office said. Told Hicks they were reviewing the line for what did he say, for a boundary clarification proceeding. Said there was an error in the original filing. Is there? Cord pulled off his outer gloves. I've worked this land 6 years. I know where Cedar Creek runs. There's no error. He looked at her directly. But if a man brings a Cheyenne lawyer and a piece of paper that says there is the county, doesn't always look past the paper to check the ground. Clara set down what she was holding and thought about this for exactly the amount of time it required. How long before a proceeding like that would be scheduled? Hicks said Greer was asking about the winter docket. County court doesn't sit until February, so 2 months, maybe a little more. Does Luke know? He doesn't talk to people in town much, and people in town... Cord stopped, started again. People in town have been waiting for this ranch to fail for 4 years, since the third woman left. Most of them figure it's only a matter of time before Greer gets what he's after. He met her eyes. I figured you ought to know. Thank you, Cord, she said. I mean that. He nodded once, pulled his gloves back on, and went out to start work. Clara stood in the kitchen and let the information settle through her the way cold settles into a room, not all at once, but finding every gap, every unguarded place. She thought about Greer's patient repeated visits. She thought about his careful choice of words, not threats, never threats, just information, just possibility, just the soft and steady pressure of a man who understood that erosion worked better than force when you had time on your side. He'd had time. He'd been waiting for Luke to be alone long enough to give up. He hadn't counted on her. When Luke came in, she told him everything Cord had said. She told him plainly, without softening it or framing it as speculation. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished, he sat with it for a moment in the particular stillness of a man absorbing something he'd half expected and hoped wasn't coming. He filed, Luke said finally. It wasn't a question. Not yet, but he's preparing to. If he gets the survey thrown out and argues the creek line from his eastern boundary marker instead of mine. He stopped. You lose the north pasture water access, Clara said. How much of your winter grazing depends on that creek? He looked at her. Enough. Then we need to find the original survey documentation, not the county copier copy, the one filed when the ranch was first deeded. It's in the deed box, he said. In the study. Have you looked at it recently? No. Then we should look at it tonight, Clara said. And we should understand exactly what it says before Greer's lawyer decides to tell us what it means. He studied her for a moment. Something in his expression had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't spent 3 weeks learning to read the subtle country of his face. But she'd learned it, and what she saw now was not just the usual measuring assessment. It was something closer to recognition, like a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been offered for the first time actual help. All right, he said. Chatelier. The deed box was old black-painted tin, and it held the compressed history of Cedar Creek Ranch in the specific disorder of a man who had always known where everything was, and therefore saw no reason to organize it for anyone else. Luke set it on the study table, and Clara went through it methodically while he stood beside her, and in 20 minutes she had what she needed. The original survey was dated 1871, filed by a territorial surveyor named James Alcott, and it was detailed in the way of careful men doing precise work, creek centerline bearing markers, reference points tied to 2 large rock formations on the eastern boundary. The water access easement was written in plain language that was almost difficult to dispute. Cedar Creek from the north pasture fence line to the winter grazing boundary was established as riparian access for the Cedar Creek ranch parcel in perpetuity. Perpetuity, Clara said quietly. Greer's lawyer will argue the survey itself is flawed, Luke said. If he can get the original measurements thrown out, the easement goes with them. Can he? Alcott's been dead 15 years. The rock formations are still there, but the county doesn't have independent verification of the bearing markers. He paused. It's not a strong argument, but it doesn't have to be strong in a county court. It just has to be confusing enough. Clara looked at the document in her hands and felt something sharpen in her. Not anger exactly, but the specific clarifying fury of a woman who has watched enough legitimate things get stolen through paperwork to recognize the pattern. This was what happened when capable men turned to legal mechanism instead of honest contest. This was what her uncle did with property, and her cousin did with inheritance, and Henry Dalton did with his assessment of her character. Wrap the thing you want in the language of process, and it starts to look like procedure instead of theft. There were 2 surveyors on this, she said, reading more carefully. Alcott was primary, but there's a second signature. Thomas Reeve, assistant surveyor. Reeve, Luke said slowly. That name, he'd be old now if he's still living. But the Territorial Survey Office in Cheyenne would have his original field notes. Surveyors kept field notes independent records of every bearing they took. She looked up. If Reeve's field notes exist, they verify Alcott's work independently. Greer's lawyer can't throw out both. Luke looked at her for a long moment. You know a lot about survey documentation, he said carefully. I know a lot about how men use paperwork to take things that aren't theirs, Clara said. I watched it happen to my mother's property for 6 years. I learned to read documents the way you learned to read cattle. Because it was survival. The word hung between them. Survival. The thing they were both in their different ways experts in. Cheyenne, he said. Someone needs to go to the territorial office before Greer's lawyer gets there first. She paused. I'll go. Clara, the roads are passable before the deep freeze. It's a 2-day ride. I can be there and back in 5 days if the weather holds. She met his eyes. Unless you think I can't manage it. I don't think that, he said immediately. Then more quietly, I don't want you going alone. It was the first time he had said anything that directly addressed what he wanted as distinct from what was practical. She felt it land, felt the difference between a man managing a situation and a man expressing actual concern, and she did not let herself react to it visibly, because she understood that calling attention to these small disclosures made him close around them the way a hand closes over something fragile if you reach for it too fast. Then come with me, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. I can't leave the ranch for 5 days in this weather. Cord can manage 3 days. You'd be back before the hard cold hits. Another silence. She could see him working through it, not the logistics she thought, but something else. The particular resistance of a man deciding whether to cross a line he's been standing behind for a long time. All right, he said. For the second time that evening. And both times, the 2 words had meant something larger than themselves. They left on a Monday. Cord had the list of what needed doing written in Clara's clear hand, with enough specificity that even Luke seemed satisfied. The mare was fit for the road, and Luke had a second horse, a solid gray gelding named Anchor, that he put Clara on without ceremony, and without the kind of labored helpfulness that would have insulted them both. The first day's ride was largely silent, which she had expected. What she hadn't expected was the quality of it, not the closed silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the open silence of 2 people who have said enough to make silence comfortable. She rode beside him and watched the country, and thought her thoughts, and occasionally one of them would say something, and the other would answer, and then they would go quiet again. And it felt, she thought, like the most natural thing she had experienced in years. They stopped for the night at a way station, a small no-frills operation that provided a roof and a hot meal for travelers run by a woman named May Gruber, who was 60-something and shaped like a barrel, and looked at Luke and Clara with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen a great many things come through her door. "You two married?" May asked, setting down 2 bowls of bean soup. "Arranged," Clara said because it was the closest true word. May looked between them. She said, in a tone that communicated an entire opinion in one syllable. After supper, Luke went out to check on the horses, and Clara sat by the small fire with her soup and thought about May's and what it implied, and what it would have implied 6 weeks ago, and what the difference was. The difference was considerable. Luke came back in shaking snow off his coat and sat across from her. May had gone to the back. They were alone with the fire between them. "She thinks we're in love," Clara said. He looked at her. "What do you think?" The question surprised her. Not because it was aggressive or pointed, but because he asked it at all. Because this quiet, self-contained man who chose every word with the economy of someone who couldn't afford waste had just asked her something that opened directly onto the most complicated interior geography she possessed. She looked at the fire. "I think I came here to survive," she said slowly, "and that I've found something that feels safer than survival, which is more than I expected." She paused. "What do you think?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I think I've spent 4 years being alone and telling myself I preferred it. And I think lately I've been less sure about that." She looked at him. The firelight moved across his face, and she thought again about Ghost at the tree line 3 months of patience before something wild was willing to be seen. "That's something," she said softly. "It's something?" He agreed. They sat with the fire between them for another hour, and they talked. Actually talked in the way she hadn't experienced since her mother went quiet, and the house in Boston became a place where real conversation was dangerous. He told her about the army, not the battles, but the silence after the way a man who had heard too much noise eventually couldn't tolerate any more of it, and how the ranch had been the first place where the quiet felt chosen rather than imposed. She told him about the seamstress shop, about the book she'd read in the back room during lunch, because no one thought to tell her she shouldn't. About the afternoon, she'd found a legal text in the charity pile and read it cover to cover, and understood for the first time that most of the constraints on her life were paper thin and only held because no one challenged them. "Paper thin," he said, "like a bad survey." She laughed. He did too, a real one, quiet and low, unused sounding, like a door opened that hadn't been opened in a long time. She felt it in her chest like a chord resolving. Outside, the snow came down in the dark, and the horses stood quiet in their stalls, and Wyoming spread itself enormous and cold and indifferent in every direction, and inside, by a small fire at a way station that neither of them would remember the name of, 2 very lonely people had the first conversation of their lives, where neither of them had to pretend to be less than they were. They reached Cheyenne on Tuesday afternoon, and the Territorial Survey Office was exactly what Clara had expected. Organized in the way of government offices, which was to say, organized for the people who worked there, rather than the people who needed information from them. She approached the counter with the deed documentation and Luke's land parcel number, and asked for Thomas Reeves' field notes from the 1871 survey, with the specific confidence of a woman who knows what she's asking for and why. The clerk, young, slightly harried, looked at her over his spectacles. "Those would be in the original survey archive. We don't generally retrieve those for landowners with a legal interest in the documentation," Clara said pleasantly. "Because that's who's asking. Cedar Creek Ranch parcel number." She read it from the deed copy, 47-9. The original survey is currently the subject of a boundary clarification proceeding being prepared in Carbon County. We need the field notes to verify the bearing markers. She set the deed copy on the counter. "I can wait." The clerk looked at Luke. Luke looked at the clerk with the expression of a man who has nothing to add to what has just been said and knows it. The clerk went to retrieve the field notes. Luke leaned against the counter beside Clara and said very quietly, "Paper thin." "Exactly," she said. The field notes existed. Thomas Reeve had been a meticulous man, every bearing taken twice. Every reference marker described in enough detail to locate it from the description alone. The notes confirmed Alcott's survey at every point independently and precisely. Greer's lawyer could not throw out one without the other, and he could not throw out both without accusing the territorial government of fraud, which was a different and significantly more dangerous proceeding. Clara had the clerk make a certified copy paid for it from the household account she'd been keeping with careful attention since her third day at the ranch, and tucked it into the document case alongside the original deed. Outside the office, Luke stopped walking and looked at her. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole case. That's the whole defense," she said. "He can still file. The county court will still hear it. But with the certified field notes, his lawyer has nothing to argue that doesn't fall apart when you put Reeves' documentation next to it. You knew exactly what to ask for. I told you. I learned to read documents because it was survival." She met his eyes. "This ranch is worth surviving for." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. Then he said with the quiet deliberateness that she'd come to understand meant he was saying something he'd chosen carefully. "So are you." The wind off the Cheyenne streets was cold and sharp, and she let it be cold because she needed something simple and physical to anchor herself to, while the rest of her processed what had just been said by a man who said almost nothing that wasn't exact. "Let's get the horses," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands in her coat pockets were not. They rode back through the second day into a headwind that made conversation impractical and thought unavoidable, and Clara spent most of it thinking about what she'd told him at the way station safer than survival, and what he'd said outside the survey office, and what the gap was between those two things, and whether she was brave enough to cross it. She was still thinking about it when they came through the Cedar Creek gate late on Wednesday afternoon, and Cord met them at the stable with a face that said something had happened. "Greer came yesterday," Cord said. "Had his lawyer with him this time." Luke swung down from his horse. "And served notice. Formal boundary proceeding filed Monday. County Court February docket." Cord looked between them. "He told me to tell you, he said to tell you that you ought to think carefully about whether the legal cost is worth it. That he'd renew his purchase offer." A pause. "He said, and I'm saying it the way he said it, he said the woman won't be there by February anyway, so you'll be making this decision alone." The stable went very quiet. Luke did not look at Clara. He looked at Cord with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, but something older and harder than anger. Something that had been quiet for a long time and was deciding with great deliberateness to stop being quiet. "Tell him," Luke said in a voice so level it was almost frightening, "that I'll see him in February court, and that he should bring his best documentation." He handed Cord Anchor's reins. "Because we will." He walked toward the house. Clara stood in the stable doorway for a moment, looking at the document case in her hands, thinking about a Cheyenne lawyer and a county court, and a certified copy of field notes signed by a meticulous dead man who had done his work carefully because he understood that careful work was the only kind that lasted. She thought about her mother who had gone quiet when the paper closed around her. She thought about herself who had not. Then she went inside, set the document case on the study table, and started making coffee, because it was cold, and they had work tomorrow. And in Wyoming territory in the winter of 1887, that was the most honest thing a person could do with everything they were feeling. Get up, stay present, and do the next necessary thing. The wolf called from the north pasture that night longer than usual, with an urgency that was different from the sounds before, less meditative, more alert. Like a warning. Like something wild that had been watching from the tree line long enough to know that the weather was about to change, and wanted to make sure the house below understood that what was coming was real, and that it was time to be ready. Clara heard it from her room and lay still and listened until it finished. She was ready. December came in hard and without mercy, the way Wyoming winter always did, not as a gradual tightening, but as a full commitment overnight, and absolute. And Cedar Creek Ranch pulled inward, the way a living thing pulls inward against cold, concentrating its heat at the center and letting the edges go. Clara had been at the ranch 7 weeks. She knew this not because she was counting down to something, but because she had stopped counting somewhere in the 5th week and only noticed the absence of it later. The way you notice a headache is gone by the sudden presence of something easier. She was not marking time anymore. She was living in it. That was a distinction she understood was significant. The mornings were hers and Luke's in a way that had become so established it felt like it had always been the 4:30 dark, the cold stable, the specific rhythm of two people who had learned each other's working pace well enough to move through shared tasks, without colliding, without negotiating, without the exhausting performance of cooperation. They just worked. Side by side, sometimes together on the same animal, sometimes across the stable from each other, and the silence between them had evolved into something that was almost its own language. She was thinking about this about language, and its absence on a Thursday morning, when she found the letter. It was not in the mail. It had been slipped under the front door sometime in the night, and she found it when she came through the main room on her way to the kitchen. A plain envelope with no postage. Her name written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. She stood in the cold room and opened it and read it twice before she was sure she understood what she was reading. It was from Ruth Callie, the third woman. The one from Ohio who had stayed 4 months and told Walt Greer that Luke wasn't right empty, she'd said, like something had gone out. Clara had carried that description in the back of her mind for weeks. A small, unresolved weight because it hadn't matched anything she'd found in the man she was living alongside. But the letter explained something about that, and the explanation was not what she expected. Ruth Callie had not left because Luke was empty. She'd left because Walt Greer had told her he would. The letter was 3 pages written in the compressed handwriting of a woman who had a great deal to say and had been waiting for the right moment to say it. Ruth had written it, she explained, because she'd heard through a cousin in Carbon County that Greer had filed a legal proceeding against Cedar Creek Ranch, and because she had information she believed was relevant, and because she had been carrying the guilt of what she knew for 11 months and had decided she was done carrying it alone. Greer had approached Ruth Callie in her 3rd month at the ranch. He had come when Luke was away at the south pasture, a trip Luke made twice a month, predictable in its timing, and he had told her with the patient specificity of a man who had prepared his argument carefully that Luke Carver was facing financial difficulty. That the ranch was not as solvent as it appeared. That a man who drove away 3 women in 3 years had a fundamental problem that no woman was going to fix, and that Ruth deserved better than to waste her life on a failing enterprise with a man who couldn't be reached. He had offered to arrange transportation back to Ohio. He had said the offer was a kindness. Ruth had believed him. She'd been lonely and lonely. People are the most susceptible to a story that explains their loneliness as someone else's fault. What she had not known, what she'd only discovered afterward from a land attorney in Columbus who'd helped her sort out a property matter the following spring, was that Greer had been in contact with a Cheyenne land broker at the same time. That the week after Ruth left Cedar Creek, Greer had made his second purchase offer on the ranch. That the timing was not coincidental. He had manufactured her departure to clear the way. And he was doing it again, with Clara. Except this time he'd filed legal paperwork instead of a personal visit because Clara, unlike Ruth, had not broken when he came to the porch. Clara stood in the cold main room and read the letter a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her work dress, and went and started the stove, and made the coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and looked at the dark north pasture, where Ghost moved unseen, and thought about manufactured departures and patient men, and what it felt like to be a woman who had been treated her entire life as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be reckoned with. She thought about her mother. Then she stopped thinking about her mother because she was not her mother, and the coffee was ready, and Luke was coming through the back door. She showed him the letter before breakfast. She set it on the table beside his coffee cup and watched him read it. His face went through a series of small, controlled adjustments. Not surprise exactly, more the look of a man whose suspicions have just been given a shape he can hold. He read it twice the way she had. Then he set it down and was quiet for a moment. He told her the ranch was in financial difficulty, he said. Flat. Not a question. Yes. It wasn't. It isn't. I know that. I've been keeping the books. Clara sat down across from him. He told her a story that explained everything she was feeling in a way that required her to leave, and she left. She paused. He's been doing this to you systematically, Luke. Not because you're difficult, because you're in the way. Luke looked at the letter without touching it again. She could see him working through it, not just the immediate facts, but the longer shape of things. 4 years of isolation. 3 women. 3 departures. And underneath all of it, a man with a water dispute and a land broker in Cheyenne who had been playing a longer and more deliberate game than any of them had understood. Ruth left in February, he said quietly. Yes. The second purchase offer came in March. She said the week after she left. He was quiet. Then in a voice that was very controlled and very precise, I thought they left because of me. The sentence landed with a weight that Clara felt in her chest. She looked at him, this contained, self-sufficient man who had spent 4 years alone and interpreted that aloneness as a verdict on his character, as evidence of some fundamental deficiency in himself. And she thought about how long a false story could run if no one challenged it. How much damage a manufactured narrative could do when the person it targeted had enough honesty and self-doubt to believe it might be true. Luke, she said carefully, listen to me. Ruth left because a man told her a story designed to make her leave. The others, I don't know the specifics. But I'd be willing to bet there was a version of Walt Greer in each of those situations, because that's how this kind of man operates. He doesn't confront. He undermines. She held his gaze. You did not drive those women away. He did. Luke's jaw was tight. He looked at the letter. I believed it, he said. For 4 years I believed. Of course you did. He told you a story that fit your existing fear. That's what a man like Greer does. He finds the wound and he presses on it, and he doesn't even need you in the room. He does it to the people around you. She paused. But he made one miscalculation. What? He assumed I was like the others, that I could be explained out of staying. She let that settle. I am not like the others. Luke looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked steadily. Outside somewhere, a horse moved in the stable, and the sound carried through the cold walls, and the whole ranch breathed around them slow and alive. No, he said finally. You're not. They needed a lawyer, and they needed one before Greer's man from Cheyenne had time to build his argument unopposed in front of a county judge, who might or might not be inclined toward Greer's interpretation of the waterline. Clara wrote 4 letters that afternoon, one to Abigail Fletcher, one to a land attorney in Laramie, whose name she'd found in the territorial legal directory she'd ordered from the Cheyenne Territorial Library in her 4th week at the ranch, one to the county court clerk, requesting the full docket schedule and filing index for the February hearing, and one to Ruth Callie, thanking her in the specific language of a woman who understands the cost of speaking up about something you stayed quiet on too long for writing. Luke watched her write them. He sat across the study table from her and drank his coffee and watched her work with the particular attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. And when she sealed the 4th envelope and looked up, he said, Where did you learn to do that? Write letters. Write letters that do something. She considered the question honestly. Boston, she said. When you live in a world that doesn't give you direct authority, you learn to work through the channels that are available. Letters, documents, records. She set the envelopes in a stack. Men like my uncle respond to official language. It's the only kind they take seriously because it's the only kind they use themselves. Greer's the same. Yes, which means we fight him in the same language. She looked at him. He's been working in the dark because he assumed you wouldn't know how to bring this into the light. He was right about that, I think, not because you're not intelligent, but because this isn't your kind of fight. You fight with work and with land and with animals, And those are real and honest ways of fighting. But Greer's using paper. She tapped the envelopes. So are we. Luke looked at the stack of letters and then at her and said with the quiet precision that meant he was choosing his words from the specific vocabulary of things he actually meant, "I'm glad you're here." She'd been waiting without knowing she was waiting for something like that. Not a declaration, not a performance. Just that. 4 words from a man who used words like currency spent only when necessary and never on anything he didn't mean. "So am I," she said. The response from Laramie came back in 9 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and the attorney's name was Daniel Forsyth. And he wrote with the competent brevity of a man who had been doing this long enough to know which sentences mattered. He confirmed that the certified field notes from Cheyenne were precisely the documentation needed. He noted that Greer's lawyer, a man named Aldous Webb, whom Forsyth appeared to have a professional opinion of, had a history of filing boundary proceedings in cases where the original survey was old enough that the field surveyors were dead, counting on the records being incomplete. He had won 3 such cases in the past 7 years. He had lost 2. Forsyth believed, based on what Clara had described, that with the Reeve field notes, this was a winnable defense. He would need to examine the original deed documentation and the certified copy in person. He could travel to Cedar Creek in January, before the February docket. Clara wrote back the same day she received his letter. She confirmed the meeting provided directions to the ranch that were specific enough that a man who had never been there could follow them, and enclosed a bank draft for the retainer from the ranch account. She showed Luke the draft before she sealed it. He looked at the amount. "That's from the cattle sale reserve." "Yes. I checked the ledger before I wrote it." She met his eyes. "Is that all right?" He looked at her for a moment, at the directness of the question, at the fact that she had checked before spending, at the fact that she was asking rather than informing. "Yes," he said. "It's all right." "Good, because Forsyth is better than whatever Greer is paying Aldous Webb, and the difference in quality is worth the cost." Luke almost smiled. It arrived more fully this time, not quite all the way, but closer than before. "You've met Webb." "No, but Forsyth's letter about him tells me everything I need to know." She sealed the envelope. "A man who wins by choosing targets with incomplete records is not a man who's good at actual argument. He's good at absence of evidence. We have evidence. He has a problem." She said it with the calm of a woman who had spent 32 years learning that the people who tried to manage her always underestimated the same thing, how much she'd been paying attention. The hard freeze came in the second week of December and settled over Cedar Creek Ranch like a held breath. The temperature dropped far enough that the well needed breaking every morning, that the cattle needed supplemental feeding twice daily, that the horses required extra attention, and the roof of the south stable developed a creak that Luke and Cord spent a Saturday reinforcing before it became something worse. Clara worked through all of it. She was up at 4:15 every morning in the stable by 4:30, moving through the cold, with the competence of a woman who had stopped needing to prove anything, and was simply doing what needed doing, because she understood that this ranch was hers. Now in all the ways that mattered, not on paper, yet. The formal arrangement of their marriage had been witnessed by Abigail Fletcher and recorded in the county, but was still new enough that Clara sometimes thought of it as pending, but in the deeper and more real sense of a place that has shaped itself around your presence and you around it. She was thinking about this, about belonging and its different forms, on a Wednesday afternoon, when Luke came in from the north pasture early, which never happened, and the look on his face stopped her before she could ask. "Ghost," he said. "What happened?" "He's hurt." His voice was level, but his jaw was set in the specific way she'd learned meant he was controlling something larger than the word. "Caught in something. Old trap, looks like, in the tree line. He's down." Clara was already moving. "Where?" "North fence near the big pine cluster." "Clara." He caught her arm, not hard, just enough to stop her. "He's a wolf. He's hurt, and he's scared, and he might—" "I know," she said. "Where are the wire cutters?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he let go of her arm and got the wire cutters himself. They went together. Ghost was exactly as Luke had described, enormous, even lying down gray as winter smoke caught at the left foreleg in an old steel trap that had no business being on Cedar Creek land, which meant someone had placed it there intentionally, or Greer's eastern boundary incursion was already real enough that his fence line was being worked in disputed territory. Luke would think about that implication later. Right now, there was a wolf in a trap, and Clara Whitmore was crouching 6 feet from him in the snow, with her hands out and her voice at a register so low and steady it was barely above the wind. "Easy," she said, to the wolf, like he could understand the intention of it, if not the word. "Easy. We're not here to hurt you." Ghost's amber eyes were on her. His sides heaved. His ears were back, not fully flat, which would have meant pure aggression, but halfway, which meant fear and pain in equal measure. He was watching her the way a wild thing watches something unknown, assessing, deciding. Luke came up slowly on the other side. "Talk to him," Clara said quietly, without looking away from Ghost. "He knows my voice," Luke said. He crouched down, began speaking in the low, continuous murmur he used with the horses. Not words exactly, just sound, steady and certain and unconcerned. Ghost's ears shifted toward him. His breathing didn't slow, but it steadied slightly. "Now," Clara said. Luke opened the trap, but the Ghost was on his feet in the same second, three-legged, moving away from them into the tree line at a speed that was impossible for an animal that hurt, and Clara sat back in the snow and let out a breath that had been a very long time in coming. Luke crouched beside her, looking at the tree line. "He'll be all right," she said, more to herself than to him. "Forelegs bruised, maybe. Trap was old, the teeth weren't sharp. He'll favor it for a week." He paused. "You were 6 feet from a cornered wolf. You were 4. I've known him 4 years. He knew I wasn't going to hurt him." She looked at the trap in Luke's hand, heavy, rusted, deliberately set. "Luke, that trap was placed on your land." His face went still. "Yes. That's not a boundary dispute anymore. That's trespassing, at minimum." His voice was quiet and absolutely serious. "With intent to damage livestock. Because Ghost ranges this pasture and everyone who knows this ranch knows that." He turned the trap over in his hands. "Greer, we can't prove it?" "No, not today." He set the trap down in the snow. "But Forsyth needs to know about this before January." Clara nodded. She was still looking at the tree line where Ghost had disappeared. She could feel the cold through her coat now that the adrenaline was settling, and she was shaking slightly in the way a person shakes after the body stops holding itself together by will. Luke noticed. He didn't say anything. He put his coat around her shoulders. Not his arm, his actual coat, shrugged off and placed around her without ceremony or romance. Purely practical, purely the act of a man who had something warm and knew she needed it. And then he stayed beside her in the cold. Both of them looking at the tree line, and neither of them moved until Ghost called once from deep in the pines. Distant, low, alive. "There," Luke said quietly. "There," she agreed. She was trembling, and she knew he knew it wasn't just from the cold, and she knew he wasn't going to mention it, and she was grateful for that in the specific and complex way that she was coming to be grateful for everything about him. Not the warmth she'd expected from a husband. Not the emotional performance she'd been told love required, but this steady, unhurried, practical care. This man who put his coat on her shoulders and stayed beside her in the cold and said there when the wolf called because it was exactly what needed saying and nothing else did. That night after supper, he asked her the question she'd been waiting for since the conversation at the way station. They were at the study table, she reviewing the legal documents, he going through the ranch accounts, which she'd reorganized in the second week, and which he'd adopted without comment, and now used with evident ease when he set down his pen and said without preamble, in the specific register of a man who has been working up to something for a while and has decided the time is now. "What do you want from this? From here?" He looked at her. "Not what you needed when you came. What you want now." Clara set down her own pen. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want this ranch to still be standing in 20 years, she said. "I want the water line secure and the cattle healthy and the south stable roof replaced properly in spring." She paused. "I want to keep the accounts and read the legal correspondence and argue with you about decisions I think are wrong and be told when I'm wrong back." She looked at him steadily. "And I want to stay." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay. Not, I want you to stay if the court case goes well. Not, I want you to stay because the ranch needs you. Just that, unqualified." The way he said everything that mattered without hedging, without performance, with the full weight of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. Outside, the wind moved across the roof with a low, sustained sound that was almost musical, and the stove held its warmth in the center of the house, and Clara Whitmore looked at Luke Carver across a study table covered in documents that represented the ongoing work of keeping something real and honest alive in a world that kept trying to take it apart, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing she had never been able to name when people asked her what she wanted. Not safety, not rescue, not even love in the way songs described it. This. A man who saw her clearly and stayed in the room. Work that meant something. Ground that was worth defending. "Then I'll stay," she said. He nodded once, picked up his pen, went back to the accounts, and that was all. And it was exactly enough. Daniel Forsythe arrived at Cedar Creek Ranch on a Tuesday in the second week of January, driving a rented buggy from Laramie with a leather satchel across his knees, and the look of a man who had seen a great many frontier properties and had learned to assess their owners within the first 5 minutes of meeting them. He was 53, compact with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of a man who spent his professional life listening more than he spoke. He shook Luke's hand at the door, shook Clara's hand with the same directness, and without the slight hesitation that most men of his era inserted before shaking a woman's hand. And then he sat at the study table and opened his satchel and got to work. He went through every document Clara had assembled, the original deed, the certified Reeve field notes, the formal notice from Greer's proceeding, Ruth Calley's letter, and the written record she'd kept of every visit Walt Greer had made to the ranch, including dates, what was said, and who was present. He read without comment for 40 minutes, while Luke and Clara sat across from him and waited. When he finished, he set the last document down and looked at them both. "You've done most of my job for me," he said. He was looking at Clara when he said it, and he said it without the quality of surprise that would have been insulting. Just recognition, clean and professional. "The Reeve field notes are exactly what we need. Webb's argument collapses against independent verification of the survey bearing markers." He tapped the stack. "But this letter from Ruth Calley, this is something else." "I thought so," Clara said. "This isn't just relevant to the water dispute. This establishes a pattern of deliberate interference with the property, a course of conduct designed to destabilize ownership." He looked at Luke. "Greer approached a woman living in your household, told her false information about your financial position with the intent of causing her departure, and timed his purchase offer for the week after she left. If we can substantiate that pattern..." "The timing is documented," Clara said. "Ruth Calley has the date of Greer's visit. Luke has the date of the purchase offer letter. It's in the deed box." Forsythe looked at her. "You checked." "Last week when I received her letter." He allowed himself a small, precise smile. "Mrs. Carver," he said, using the name with natural ease, as though it had always been hers, and she felt it land with a quiet weight she hadn't anticipated. "I want to expand the scope of our response to Greer's filing. Not just a defense of the water easement, but a counter-complaint. Tortious interference with property rights, filing a proceeding based on a survey challenge he had reason to know was unsupported." He paused. "And trespass. With the trap." "We can't prove the trap was Greer," Luke said. "No, but we can prove it was on your land and that it injured an animal that ranges your property, and we can introduce it as part of a documented pattern of boundary incursion." Forsythe looked at them both. "I want Greer walking into that February courthouse, not as a plaintiff with a survey complaint, but as a defendant with a conduct problem. That changes the entire shape of the proceeding." Luke was very still. Clara watched him absorb it, the shift from defense to offense, from a posture he'd maintained for 4 years, without realizing he'd assumed it to something entirely different. "How strong is it?" Luke asked. "With what you have strong enough that Webb will be advising Greer to settle before the hearing if he's half the lawyer he thinks he is." Forsyth closed his satchel. "But I need one more thing. Is there anyone in Cedar Creek who has direct knowledge of Greer's conduct toward this property? Anyone who's witnessed his visits, heard his statements, observed the pattern?" Clara thought of Cord immediately. Then she thought of someone else. "Pete Aldridge," she said. Luke looked at her. "He owes you 3 months of fence repair credit," she said. "He's been paying it off slowly this winter. I've seen the supply ledger. He comes in for materials and charges against the account." She looked at Luke steadily. "He was with Greer the second time Greer came to the porch. He heard everything Greer said to me, and he laughed when I answered back." She paused. "A man who laughs when someone pushes back against a bully is not fully committed to the bully. He just hasn't been given a reason to step away from him yet." Forsyth looked between them. "Can you get to him?" "I can try," Clara said. "Don't try," Forsyth said simply. "Do. We have 3 weeks." She went to Aldridge's spread the next morning alone, before Luke had finished the North Pasture check, because she wanted to have this conversation without the presence of Luke's complicated history, with the man making everything harder than it needed to be. Pete Aldridge answered his door with the look of someone who had been expecting a different caller and was recalibrating fast. He was younger up close than she remembered, mid-30s, with an honest face that had the quality of a man who had not yet decided what kind of person he was going to be. "Mrs. Carver," he said. "Mr. Aldridge, may I come in?" He stepped back. She came in. His kitchen was what she expected of a single man managing a modest spread alone, functional, sparse, not unhappy. She sat at his table without being invited because waiting to be invited was a technique for people with time to spare, and they had 3 weeks. "I want to talk to you about Walt Greer," she said. Aldridge sat down slowly. "I figured. You were there when he came to our porch the second time. You heard what he said." "I heard." "You've known him a long time. Since I came out here, 7 years. He looked at his hands on the table. "He helped me get set up, gave me credit at the supply when I was short in the first year." "I understand that," Clara said. "And I'm not asking you to pretend that doesn't matter. But I need you to answer me something honestly, and I need you to think about your answer before you give it." He looked at her. "Do you believe that what he's doing to Cedar Creek Ranch is right?" she said. "Not legal, not advantageous, right." The silence stretched. Outside, a horse moved in Aldridge's small stable. The wind pushed at the walls with a low, sustained pressure. "No," Aldridge said, quietly, without drama. He told the last woman who lived with Luke that the ranch was in financial trouble. It wasn't. He told her so that she'd leave and clear the way for his purchase offer. She held Aldridge's gaze. "And he put a trap in the North Pasture, on Luke's land. That caught a wolf." Aldridge's face changed. "I didn't know about the trap." "I know you didn't. Because if you had, I think you'd have said something." She leaned forward slightly. "Pete, Greer isn't going to win this. We have documentation that dismantles his survey argument and a lawyer in Laramie who's going to walk into that February courthouse with a counter-complaint about his conduct toward this property going back 4 years. He is going to lose." She paused. "What I'm asking you is whether you want to be on the right side of that when it's done, or whether you want to be standing next to a man who's just had his method of operation exposed to a county judge." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" Clara set a piece of paper and a pen on his table. "A written account of what you witnessed on our porch in November. What Greer said, what you heard, dated and signed." He looked at the paper, then he picked up the pen. She told Luke that night. He listened without interrupting the way he always did, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, with a quality of silence she recognized now, not absence, but the specific interior weight of a man processing something that's changed his understanding of his own situation. "Aldridge," he said. "He's not a bad man. He's just been standing next to one and hasn't had a compelling reason to move." She set the signed statement on the table. "He has one now." Luke picked up the statement, read it, set it down. "You went alone," he said. "Yes." "You could have told me." "You would have come with me, and the conversation needed to be without you in it." She met his eyes. He needed to make the choice on his own terms, not because Luke Carver was standing in his kitchen. Luke looked at her steadily. She could see him working through the logic of it, testing it for flaws, finding none. "You were right," he said. It came out without qualification, without the particular masculine resistance that most men in her experience inserted before admitting that a woman's judgment had been correct where theirs might not have been. Just "you were right," clean and direct. She picked up the statement and put it with the other documents. "I usually am," she said. "You're getting better at knowing that." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and entirely real. The week before the February hearing, Greer came to the ranch for the last time. He came alone, which was different, and he came in the early afternoon, which meant he'd timed it for when he expected Luke might be away at the south pasture. He hadn't accounted for the fact that Clara had reorganized the weekly schedule in December, and Luke now did the south pasture check in the morning on Tuesdays. Luke was at the kitchen table when Greer knocked. He answered the door himself. Whatever Greer had prepared to say, it rearranged itself when he found Luke, instead of Clara, or an empty house. He recovered quickly, he was practiced at this, and produced a version of his neighborly smile. "Carver, didn't expect to find you in." "Changed my schedule," Luke said. He didn't invite Greer inside. He stood in the doorway with the particular economy of a man who has decided exactly how much space to give something and is not going to give more. Clara came up behind Luke's shoulder. She didn't say anything. She stood there, and Greer looked at her, and whatever calculation he'd been running adjusted again. "I came to talk about the proceeding," Greer said, "before it goes to court. See if there's a solution that works for everyone." "There is," Luke said. "You withdraw the filing." Greer's smile held, but only by effort. "Now, Luke." "My lawyer's name is Daniel Forsyth out of Laramie," Luke said. "He'll be presenting the original survey field notes independently certified, along with a counter-complaint regarding your conduct toward this property over the past 4 years. He paused. "Including testimony from a witness who was present during at least one of your visits here." Greer went very still. "The water easement is documented in language that doesn't leave room for your argument," Luke continued. "The field notes verify the survey at every bearing marker. You have nothing to stand on except a legal filing you made on the assumption that I didn't have the documentation to fight back." He looked at Greer steadily. "You were wrong about that." Greer looked at Clara. The look had a question in it, trying to trace back through events to the moment things had stopped going the way he planned them. "You went to Cheyenne," he said. "Not to Luke, to her." "We went to Cheyenne," she said. "Together." Something moved across Greer's face. Not shame exactly, but the specific cold discomfort of a man who has been engineering something for a long time and has just understood that the mechanism failed. "The Reeve notes," he said slowly. "Thomas Reeve was a thorough man," Clara said. "He took every bearing twice. His notes are in excellent condition." She held Greer's gaze with the same calm she'd used on the first day of his visit, when she'd told him she'd find out what he wanted and why. She had found out. "Mr. Greer, your lawyer knows this case is lost. If he's good at his job, he's already told you. Withdraw the filing before February and walk away, and the counter-complaint stays conditional. Push it to the courthouse, and everything we have about your conduct toward this ranch goes into the public record of a county court proceeding." She let that settle. "That's the solution that works for everyone. It's the only one on the table." Greer looked between them. The smile was gone entirely now. What was left was the face underneath not monstrous, just ordinary. A man who had wanted something that wasn't his, and had been patient and systematic about trying to take it, and who was now standing in front of the evidence that it hadn't worked. "You're a difficult woman," he said. It came out without force, like an observation rather than an accusation. "Yes," Clara said. "I've been told." He stood for another moment. Then he put his hat back on his head, nodded once. Not at Clara, not at Luke, at some private acknowledgement of the situation, and walked back to his horse. They watched him ride out through the gate. Luke closed the door. The kitchen was warm and quiet and exactly what it had always been, and Clara stood in it and felt the specific relief of a thing that has been threatening to arrive, finally. Resolving not with drama, not with the violence of a storm breaking, but with the quiet definitive movement of a situation reaching its conclusion, the way good things concluded with the right side simply holding its ground long enough that the wrong side had nowhere left to go. "He'll withdraw," Luke said. "Yes," Clara said. "He will." The withdrawal came in writing 4 days later, delivered to Forsyth's office in Laramie, who sent notice to Cedar Creek by the next post rider. Forsyth's letter was brief and carried the satisfied tone of a man who enjoys being right about his assessments. Webb had advised withdrawal the same day Forsyth filed the counter-complaint. The conditional status of the counter-complaint would stand for 1 year. Any further conduct by Greer toward Cedar Creek Ranch property or its residents within that period would result in immediate filing. Clara read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it down beside her coffee cup. Luke was across from her. He read it once, set it back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Luke reached across the table, not for the letter, not for his cup. He set his hand over hers. Not with pressure, not with the theatrical weight of a man making a moment. Just his hand over hers, warm and certain, the way he did everything that actually mattered. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. She turned her hand under his and held it, and that was all, and it was everything. February settled into March with a slowness that felt earned. The deep cold began to release its grip on Cedar Creek in increments, not warmth yet, not anything a person from the east would have recognized as spring, but a softening, a shift in the quality of light and the behavior of the animals that Luke read like a language she was still learning. The cattle moved differently when the worst was passing. The horses grew restless in a different way than the restlessness of severe cold. And Ghost came back to the near fence. He came back on a Sunday in the 3rd week of February, whole and solid on all 4 legs, the bruised foreleg evidently healed or healed enough. He stood at the fence line in the early morning and looked at the house with his amber eyes for a long moment, and Clara was at the kitchen window and saw him. And she did not move, and he did not move, and they regarded each other across the distance of the near pasture, in the particular silence of 2 things that have established without formal agreement a mutual understanding. Then Ghost turned and disappeared into the tree line at a walk unhurried, as if he had come only to confirm something and had confirmed it and was satisfied. Luke came into the kitchen a few minutes later and found Clara at the window with her coffee looking at the empty pasture. "Ghost," she said. "I know. I saw him from the stable." He poured his own coffee and stood beside her. "He's all right. He looked good. He's a resilient animal." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought when I saw him in that trap I thought he wouldn't make it back, or that he'd range further north after, stay away from people." "He came back," Clara said. "He came back," Luke said. There was something in his voice, the same layered quality she'd learned to hear in him, the way a sentence about one thing contained the weight of something larger. She didn't call attention to it. She just stood beside him and let the sentence mean what it meant. The morning light was coming through the window now, the particular thin gold of February morning in Wyoming, and it fell across the kitchen table, and across the document case on the study shelf, and across the 2 coffee cups on the counter, and across both of them standing at the window. And it was ordinary and specific and completely real, and Clara thought this is what she had come for. Not this moment in particular, but this This quality of a life that was hers, built from the ground up on terms she had set in a place she had chosen, beside a man who had chosen her back. Abigail Fletcher came in March, which surprised Clara until she received the letter announcing it and read the reason she was retiring. 31 years of brokering arrangements across Wyoming territory, and she was closing the practice and moving to live with her sister in Denver, and she had a handful of final matters to close out before she went. Cedar Creek Ranch was one of them. She arrived looking the same as she always had. Composed, practical, slightly formidable, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Clara made, and looked around the kitchen with the appraising eye of a woman taking stock. "The place is different," she said. "It's the same place," Clara said. "No, it isn't." Abigail looked at her. "I've been here 3 times before, bringing women out, watching them leave. The house felt suspended, like it was waiting for something." She looked around the kitchen again. "It doesn't feel that way now." Luke came in from the morning check and sat at the table, and Abigail looked at him with the particular look she'd directed at him across the Laramie hotel room the day Henry Dalton walked out. And something in it was different now, warmer, but also satisfied, the look of a woman who has been right about something and has lived long enough to see the evidence. "You look better," she told him. "I'm the same," he said. "No, you're not." She said it the same way Clara had, not as a rebuke, but as an observation that had enough warmth in it to be a compliment. He looked at Clara briefly. Clara looked at her coffee cup. Abigail reached into her bag and produced a document. "There's the matter of the formal registration of your arrangement with the territorial clerk. The original filing was provisional standard for mail order situations in the first 3 months. You need to sign the permanent record." She set it on the table. "Both of you. Then it's done." Clara looked at the document. It was a single-page territorial seal at the top, their names printed in the clerk's careful hand, with spaces for signatures at the bottom. A permanent record, not provisional. She picked up the pen Abigail offered. Then she stopped, looked at Luke. "Are you certain?" she said. It was the question she hadn't asked when he said he wanted her to stay, because that moment hadn't required it. But this moment did, because this was paper and paper was permanent, and she needed not reassurance, but honesty. His actual honesty. The kind she'd come to trust above everything else, because she'd never caught him without it. Luke looked at her across the table. He did not hesitate. "I came to this ranch at 28 years old, he said, "and I built something, and then I spent 10 years trying to share it with someone and failing, and eventually I stopped thinking it was possible." He paused. "And then you arrived with your trunk and a note from Abigail, and you loaded your own trunk and drove yourself out here and made coffee at 5 in the morning and told Walt Greer exactly what he was doing and went to Cheyenne and came back with the document that ended a 4-year campaign against this property." He held her gaze. "You didn't need saving. You didn't need managing. You needed ground to stand on." He paused. "I have a great deal of ground, and I'd like you to stand on it." Abigail Fletcher was very quiet on the other side of the table. Clara looked at Luke Carver, this still particular unperforming man who had just said more in 30 seconds than most men managed in a year of trying. And she thought about her mother in her Boston bedroom and herself on the Laramie platform, and Henry Dalton handing back her bag, and all the long cold miles between that woman and this moment, and she thought, "I made it here by being exactly what they said was wrong with me. Every step of the way." She signed the document. He signed it. Abigail signed as witness with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has done this many times and finds this particular instance more satisfying than most. "There," Abigail said. She tucked the document back in her bag. "Done." She stood, picked up her coat. Then she stopped and looked at Clara. "Henry Dalton," she said, "married a woman from Sheridan County in January. Very quiet, very agreeable, does exactly as she's told." She paused. "He came to me last month and asked if I had anyone else like you." She allowed herself a small, precise smile. "I told him no. Those don't come through twice." She let herself out. The door closed. The kitchen was quiet. Luke looked at the closed door, then at Clara. What did she tell him? That I was one of a kind, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't wrong, he said. Spring came to Cedar Creek Ranch the way it always did. Not gently, not in the manner of eastern springs with their gradual flowering and mild advance, but abruptly and decisively, the ground going from frozen to mud. In the course of a week, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the cattle restless and the horses spirited, and everything that had been held tight all winter, releasing at once into the particular chaotic aliveness of a Wyoming spring. Clara was in the stable on a morning in early April, working with Calico, who had over the course of the winter developed a complex and opinionated relationship with Clara that Luke watched with something between amusement and recognition when Cord came through the door with a look on his face that she'd learned to read. "Rider coming," he said. "From which direction?" "East, not Greer's Road." She came out to see. The rider was a woman, which was unusual enough on this road to be notable, and as she got closer, Clara recognized the round face and the particular upright posture of someone who had been raised to sit a horse like it mattered. Ruth Callie pulled up at the fence and looked down at Clara with the careful look of a woman who has been carrying something for 11 months and doesn't quite know how the person she's bringing it to is going to receive it. "Mrs. Carver," she said. "Miss Callie." Clara looked up at her. "Get down. Come in." Ruth dismounted. She was a solid, capable-looking woman, mid-40s, with the kind of honest face that shows what it's feeling without meaning to. She looked around the ranch with an expression that was complicated, the specific expression of someone returning to a place that holds their most complicated decision. "I got your letter," she said, following Clara toward the house. "The one you wrote back after mine. I meant everything I said in it." "I know. That's why I came." Ruth stopped just inside the kitchen door. Is Mr. Carver?" "In the north pasture. He'll be back at noon." Clara poured coffee without asking, brought it to the table. "Sit down, Ruth." Ruth sat. She held the coffee cup with both hands, the way people do when they need something warm to anchor them. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "When I figured out what Greer had done, I should have come back and told him." "You came when you were ready to," Clara said, "and your letter made the difference. You need to know that." "He didn't drive me away," Ruth said. It came out with a specific weight that Clara recognized, the weight of a sentence a person has needed to say for a long time. "Carver. He was hard to live with, and I was lonely. And I let Greer talk me into believing it was all Luke's fault because it was easier. But he never—" She stopped. "He was never cruel. He was just very alone. I didn't know how to be in that kind of quiet." "Most people don't," Clara said. Ruth looked at her. "How did you—" Clara thought about it honestly. "I'd been in a different kind of quiet my whole life," she said. "The kind where you're surrounded by noise and still completely alone. This kind, his kind, was at least honest about itself." She paused. "And it turned out there was a great deal inside it if you didn't rush it." Ruth nodded slowly. She looked down at her coffee. "He's all right, truly. He's better than all right." Clara said it with a certainty she felt in her chest, the kind that had been built not from a single thing, but from 700 small accumulated things over the course of a long Wyoming winter. "He's the best man I've ever known. He just needed someone to stop long enough to actually see that." When Luke came in at noon and found Ruth Callie at his kitchen table, he stopped. He looked at her with an expression Clara had never seen on his face before, not guarded, not closed, but genuinely surprised. Surprised in the way of a man encountering something he'd given up expecting. Ruth stood. "Mr. Carver," she said, "I came to say I'm sorry for leaving the way I did, and for believing—" She stopped, tried again. "I let someone convince me of things that weren't true. About you, about this place. And I should have had more sense, and I didn't. And I'm sorry." The kitchen was very still. Luke looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in his level and unhurried way, "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself one." He moved to the table and sat down. "Coffee." Ruth blinked. Then she laughed, a startled, relieved sound. "Yes, she said. Please. Clara poured it. She caught Luke's eye across the kitchen and held it for a moment, and what passed between them in that moment was not a word and not a gesture, but something that had been building since November and had no name yet and didn't need one. Ruth stayed for lunch and left by mid-afternoon, and she left differently than she'd arrived, lighter somehow, with the particular looseness of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told they're allowed to set it down. Clara stood at the fence and watched her ride east until she was out of sight. Luke came to stand beside her. She's all right, he said. She will be. Clara turned from the fence. Greer told her a story about you that fit what she was already afraid of. She believed it for 11 months. She came all the way out here to stop believing it. She looked at him. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She started walking back toward the house, and he walked beside her, and the early April afternoon was cold still, but with the particular cold that has given up its worst intention and is now simply weather rather than a condition of existence. I want to expand the south pasture fence this summer, she said. Before the heat. If we push it another 100 yards, we pick up grazing room for at least 12 more head. I've been thinking the same thing, he said. Cord can handle the posts if we get the wire ordered from Laramie before May. I'll write Forsyth for a recommendation on the supply. Forsyth's a lawyer. He knows the Laramie suppliers. He mentioned it. Fine, write him. She pulled open the back door. And we need to talk about the south stable roof before summer. The repair cord made in December will hold through spring, but not through summer heat. I know. The Reeve Field notes should be stored separately from the deed box, she said. In case of fire, 2 copies in 2 locations. I'll make a copy this week. She stopped in the doorway and turned. He was right behind her, close in the particular way of 2 people who have stopped calculating the distance between them and simply exist at whatever distance is natural. She looked at him. This man who had spent years alone and interpreted it as verdict and had been wrong. This man who put his coat on her shoulders in the snow and said there, when the wolf called and signed his name next to hers on a permanent record without hesitation, and she thought about everything they'd built in the course of one Wyoming winter. Not romance in any way the storybooks described it, not rescue in either direction. Something rarer and more durable than either 2 people who had each been told in different languages that the truest thing about them was a flaw finding each other and discovering that those exact things, her stubbornness, his silence, were not the problem. They were the foundation. Luke, she said. Yes. I would have driven myself out here in a blizzard. He looked at her. A pause. I know. I just want you to understand that none of it is because I needed you to save me. I know that, he said. He said it without defense, without qualification. I never thought you did. Good. She held his gaze. Because what I needed was exactly what you had. Ground to stand on, quiet that was honest, work that meant something. She paused. And a man who looked at me the way you looked at Calico on the first morning and thought she's not being difficult. She's being honest. Luke was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon settled around them, the ranch breathing its particular breath, the cattle moving in the south field, Ghost somewhere in the northern tree line, alive and whole and at home in his own wild territory. Then Luke Carver, who used words like, "A man spends money he's earned and never wastes a cent of it," said, "I looked at you the first morning and thought she loaded her own trunk." Clara felt it land somewhere deep and permanent. "That was enough," she said. "That was everything," he said. She turned and went inside, and he followed, and the door closed behind them, and Cedar Creek Ranch held them both in its cedar post walls, and its hard-won ground, and its honest winter-tested permanence. And outside in the north pasture, a gray wolf moved through the greening grass of an early Wyoming spring, unhurried, purposeful, exactly where he belonged, and the creek ran clear and cold along the survey line that no one would ever successfully dispute again. And the sky over Wyoming went on forever in every direction, wide and indifferent and absolutely beautiful. The same sky it had always been over a ranch that had finally, after a very long time, become a home. Clara Whitmore had come to Wyoming to survive. She had stayed because she had found something worth building. And she had built it not because someone rescued her, and not in spite of who she was, but because of exactly who she was, every stubborn, precise, unsilenceable inch of her. That was the truth of it. That was the whole truth. And it was more than enough.